It's a privilege to have the opportunity to speak to you all again, and on the last encounter as well. I do hope that the word that God has put on my heart will equip us and be the right word for us all to sort of take into the summer break. I'd like to begin by reading from the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus and chapter 3, and reading from verse 1. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Shall we pray? Father, we thank you for your word and all that it has to teach us. And we just pray that you help us this morning. Help me, I pray, as I seek to explore it and search out its truths. And help us all listen to what it is that you would have your Spirit teach us. I pray this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. If you've lived more than a couple of years, and I think pretty much we all have, then you'll have had the experience of going to a place that you had once been before, maybe a house, a restaurant, even a city, only to find that when you go back, it's changed, perhaps irreversibly. And it might not have changed for the worse, but it's just different. And somehow, the thing you enjoyed before, that experience, is not so enjoyable anymore. As a contrast, there are places that we go frequently and they're unchanged. Maybe it's a favorite park, maybe Granny's house, something like that. And the experience, whilst it's enjoyable anyway, somehow it's enhanced through that familiarity. And we have the sense that this is something we've known before, and we're delighted to know and experience it again. And this was brought home to me quite recently when I was visiting my parents, because at the end of the road that you go up before you get to their house used to be my old secondary school. And now it's been knocked down, and there's a new housing development there called, for what it matters, Chiswick Village. And whilst this new development's a very nice place, it's a lovely place with beautiful houses and parks and restaurants, I couldn't help but be saddened that my old school was no longer there. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't a great school. In fact, it was let's just say it wasn't great. It had problems, and not all of my memories of the school are positive. But yet somehow it still seemed sad to me that never again would children run through the corridors of the building that used to be there. Never again would their noise echo through that place. And I think there's something inside all of us that can relate to that in some way. Something inside each of us that wants things to stay the same. The good things, of course, that is. Whilst all around us, different circumstances, different forces demand that things change. Buildings crumble. Sadly, friendships fade, perhaps just through separation. Our bodies tire and age. In the world, nations rise and fall. And of course, the older one is, the easier it is to relate to this, and the more changes one will have seen. But I think even the youngest, even a teenager, knows that feeling of having to throw away an old t-shirt or an old top that just simply has too many holes for it to be worn anymore. That reluctance of separation and of embracing change. And I think actually, today, perhaps more than ever, there's something even deeper inside each of us that wishes that things could just stay the same. So much turmoil, so much change in the world around. Wouldn't it be nice if things could just stay the same, even for a couple of years only, so that we can just live? I think truly we do long for a sense of stability, even though you might say, I'm a person who likes change, but I'm pretty sure that no one here likes change so much that if you went home, you found another person living in your house, and you had to go and find somewhere else to live. We all value a certain measure of stability and security. And as I was thinking about this, and from time to time, I get a little bit philosophical. And I thought, well, why is it that we value stability and security? Because after all, of course, there are some people who say, well, everything around us is just the random product of a massive explosion in space. Loads of particles are flying around, and here we are. But, well, if that was the case, then wouldn't we enjoy everything being up in the air all the time? I don't think it is, really. And it was the wise King Solomon who said in the book of Ecclesiastes that God has put eternity into the heart of man. And when you think that through, eternal things are things that last forever. And things that last forever do not change. So we can say that it was God who put this desire in our hearts for things that last, this desire for stability and security. And essentially, it's a desire for God himself. And that's what I'd like us to think about this morning. And we've touched on it already in our thoughts in the breaking of bread and in the prayers. I want to think about one particular characteristic of God. And that is the fact that he is unchanging. And over the next few moments, I just want to look at a few verses, including the chapter in Exodus that we've read, that show that God is unchanging. But then I'd like us to think some more about why it's a good thing, generally, that God's unchanging, But I'd also like us to think why it's a good thing for us more personally that he's unchanging. So let's begin with this passage that we've read, chapter 3 of the book of Exodus. And before we get into some of the details of it, I think it would be helpful for us to remind ourselves what has happened before in the events that were leading up to this chapter and this remarkable experience that Moses had. So Moses, as most of us are aware, was a Jew, an Israelite, and the Israelites, God's special people, were at this time living in captivity in Egypt. They were being kept as slaves. But as we know from the passage, Moses wasn't in Egypt. He was in Midian, tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. And why was he there in Midian and not in Egypt? Well, Pharaoh had been persecuting the Israelites and said, I want all the male babies to be killed at birth, drowned, so that the Israelites don't become too powerful in the land. But Moses' mother and many of the other Israelites didn't obey this command. And Moses was put in a basket and placed in a river, where eventually he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who took him to the palace and raised him as her own son. And then Moses was raised as a prince. He had a full princely education and enjoyed all the privileges of being a prince in a mighty nation. However, he never forgot, did he, that by birth he was an Israelite and that his people, the Israelites, were slaves in Egypt. And this obviously weighed upon him because one day he saw an Egyptian slave master beating an Israelite. And this enraged him and he killed the Egyptian slave masters. And then he went to the Israelites and said, look what I've done for you. But they didn't say thank you. They didn't embrace him as one of their own. Rather, they rejected him and threatened to expose what he had done. And so he fled from Egypt. And then we find him here in Midian looking after the sheep that belonged to his father-in-law. And this is one of the details I'd just like to pick up on because the passage could have just said, well, he was out in the wilderness when God spoke to him, but it doesn't. It says he was looking after the sheep of his father-in-law. And I think this is significant because if we were to wind the clock back even further to Joseph, the first Israelite who went to Egypt, and how his brothers were trying to join him eventually when all the famines were happening, and he was going to provide for them through the special sort of place that he'd been given in the palace. Joseph said to his brothers, when Pharaoh calls you and asks your occupation, say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, because every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, I don't know why the Egyptians didn't like shepherds. Maybe they were like parking wardens. For some reason, there was something about them that made them a little bit, you didn't really want to know a shepherd. I don't know why. So never in a million years would an Egyptian prince have been out in the desert tending sheep, let alone sheep that belonged to somebody else. Yet here Moses was, and how his circumstances had changed. And then he has this amazing encounter with God through the burning bush. I'm not going to dwell on the burning bush too much, but we know that it was enough to attract Moses' attention, as you can imagine. And God spoke to Moses out of that burning bush, which doesn't surprise me at all because he's God and he can do whatever he likes. And one of the things he says was, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry, and I have come to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Moses can't believe it, because what else God said was, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Who am I, says Moses, that I should go to Pharaoh? Well, you might say, well, you were a prince. Come on, Moses, if anyone's going to go, it's you. But understandably, he was reluctant and he felt his inadequacy. And God doesn't really answer Moses directly. And he doesn't say, well, Moses, you're a fine chap. You've got got a mouth and 2 legs and 2 arms. You can go and speak. No, he actually gives him a different piece of information, and arguably a far more important piece of information, because he says, I will be with you. I will be with you. But even that actually wasn't enough for Moses. And so he says, what if I go to the people of Israel? And you can almost hear him say, you know, Lord, the ones who I've already tried to help, the ones who rejected me, what if I go and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me? What if they ask me your name? What shall I tell them? And then God says these majestic words to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Wow. And this is where I want us to pause for most of the rest of the meeting, because whilst also being God's name, it's also a fundamental description of who God is. And first I want us to observe what God does not say. He does not say to Moses, I am if you believe I am. And I think there are many people today in the world, maybe in the church, I don't know, and they think that God and his characteristics are somehow dependent upon their belief or lack of belief in him. But no, God's not just there if we believe in him. He is there, and he is who he is, whether we believe in him or not. What else does God not say? He does not say, Moses, tell them, I am who you want me to be. He doesn't tell them that. He doesn't say that. But after all, you might think, well, that would be quite a good thing, wouldn't it? I am who you want me to be. A God who will do anything we ask of him, solve all our problems, just the way we'd like them to be solved. No. He says, I am who I am. And we may have our views on what God could or should be, or what he could or should be doing, but he is who he is. And nothing that we might think about him will change that. And what else can we glean from this name? Well, firstly, I think it's clear that God wanted Moses to emphasize to the Israelites that he existed. I am. What else does that say but I exist? And why would he have wanted Moses to communicate that fact to the Israelites? Well, I think it was probably because the Israelites, after many years of slavery and backbreaking work, had probably begun to doubt that God was even there. And of course, this is similar to an objection that a lot of people have about God. What about all the suffering? What about all these terrible things that are happening to me in the world? But I want to suggest that just because there's suffering, that doesn't disprove God at all. It doesn't mean he's not there, or even that he's good. He is there. And we know from the stories in the Bible and from our own experiences that he does intervene in this world, but he just doesn't do it when or how we'd like him to. His ways simply are not our ways. And I think that even when we've been Christians for some time, doubts can still creep in, particularly when the path of faith gets narrow and steep. When the burdens just seem unbearable, we can be tempted to ask ourselves, is he really there? I picked up my cross and followed him. Was it really worth it? In each case, God's name has a message for us. I am here, I exist. And others have suggested, and as we thought this morning, that this name speaks of his self-sufficiency. He is who he is. He does not need anyone or anything to sustain him. Like the constantly burning bush, he is self-igniting and self-fueling. He doesn't run out, and he has no beginning. But as I mentioned earlier, it's this one characteristic that I want us to think about this morning. The fact that God does not change. He is who he is. And this is a characteristic of God that's mentioned many, many times throughout the Bible. So I think it must be very important and definitely worth us considering for a moment. The Psalms in particular, as I'm sure some of you will know, mention this characteristic frequently. And my favorite, I think, is Psalm 102, verses 25 to 27. It says, "Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end." The psalmist takes what's perhaps the most solid and enduring thing you can think of, the foundations of the earth, and then he adds another, the heavens above, the stars. And he says, compared to the certainty and the stability found in God, these things are just like an old t-shirt, ready to be folded up at a moment's notice. And then once more, God, speaking directly through the prophet Malachi, says explicitly, "I, the Lord, do not change." And there are lots of other verses, but I want us to move on to the next part, which is, why is it a good thing, generally, that God doesn't change? Because I have to confess, immediately, it wasn't obvious to me why it was a good thing that God doesn't change. And I think this is partly because I, like others, have been brought up in a generation where everything's changing all the time. Technology just developing at a rapid pace. New things on the market with human capabilities are changing every day. And not only that, we live in this age where, in 24 hours you can go to almost anywhere on the planet. So, it's nothing to see other cultures and be exposed to these great varieties. And so you might think, well, in this kind of sort of fast-paced and exciting world that we live in, that it would be, boring for God not to change. And perhaps even that, an unchanging God is a God who's in some way that's unfeeling or inactive. But I want to suggest that that's far from the case. And let's consider the alternative for a moment. Imagine there was a God, but his character and his qualities were very changeable. They were changing all the time. One moment he was pleased with bad behavior. The next minute, displeased. One moment forgiving. The next moment merciful. One moment blessing. One moment cursing us. How would you know where you stand? What confidence could you have that the God you dealt with yesterday is the same God that you're going to deal with today and tomorrow? The fact that he doesn't change provides a firm foundation upon which we can base our lives and understand the world around us. And it's also a good thing that God doesn't change because of who he has revealed himself to be in the past. It enables us to truly know him. Note what God says to Moses at verse 15. He says, "Say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you." It was vital that the children of Israel knew that the God speaking to Moses was the same God who had spoken to their forefather Abraham, and who had also been with Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and so on. And that would have meant nothing if God and all his attributes were constantly changing. What difference would it make if it was the God that your forefathers were worshipping years ago? There's a writer called James Packer who's written a book called Knowing God, and he makes this observation, which I think is worth repeating. He says, when we read some of the ancient stories in the Bible, it's all intensely interesting, but it all seems very far away. We feel that we are, so to speak, on the outside of the Bible world, looking in. We're mere spectators, and that is all. Yes, it's true that in terms of time, space, and culture, they are a very long way from us. But the link between them and us is not found at that level. The link is God himself. For with the God with whom they had to do is the same God with whom we have to do. And I want us to just dwell on that for a second, because the God that we've gathered together before today is the same God that spoke to Moses out of the burning bush. It's the same God that delivered the Israelites out of the hand of the Egyptians. The same God who handed the city of Jericho to Joshua, the same God who helped David overcome Goliath, and the same God that delivered Daniel from the lion's den. Because these are not just pleasant stories, but they're evidence of a God who cares, a God who's present, a God who's active, and a God who's powerful. No, he doesn't always intervene when we want him to or how we'd like him to, but he's there. And just as he's delivered people in the past, so he can deliver us again today, no matter what we're going through. And when we think about a God who doesn't change and who he has revealed himself to be, we're not just limited to looking at what God has done in the lives of characters from the Bible. We can also look at what he's done in our own lives, but also in the lives of other Christians and believers that have gone before. And I don't know if you're into history or not, and I can't say I'm a big historian, but sometimes it's worth looking at the history of the church and the lives of people that have gone before. And one particular area that particularly fascinates me is the experiences of the early church, the church that Jesus left behind when he went up into heaven. And how against all the odds, how against persecution from the Roman Empire, it grew and flourished at such an astonishing rate. I just don't know how that could have happened if God was not in it. Because for the first few years, being a Christian pretty much meant certain death. And I was reading a while ago an eyewitness account of the early Christian martyrs and how they were led from captivity into the Roman arenas to meet their deaths at the hands of gladiators and lions. And the eyewitness account said this: "They marched from the prison joyfully, as though they were going to heaven, with calm faces, trembling, if at all with joy rather than fear." Amazing. No wonder a whole civilization eventually sat up and took notice. And it's the same God who gave those martyrs the strength to die with such dignity and courage that has the power to enable us to endure and to endure joyfully through the experiences that come our way. But ultimately, the real reason that Christianity flourished in the way that it did is because Jesus Christ, co-equal and co-eternal with God, doesn't change either. The writer to the Hebrews said, "He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, just as able to bless, just as able to meet our needs, just as compassionate today as he has been throughout the centuries and as he will be in the future. Come unto me, all you who are weary and laden, and I will give you rest." And this was one of the ways in which it matters to us personally that God does not change. The psalmist also wrote, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." This was the verse that Martin Luther put into song. "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing." You cannot say such things of an uncertain and a changeable God. There's no security and no safety there. Recently, I was driving through Newport, and most of you will probably know or have seen the cenotaph just below Clarence Tower. And it's essentially a large monument to honor those people that fought and died in the First and Second World War. And on it is written these words: "Their memory endureth forever." And I don't know why, but this one occasion it just struck me as I was going past it. And we go past it every day, or at least every time we come here. And it saddened me. And I think firstly it saddened me because it just reminded me of the horrors of war and the fact that so many people died, more or less because of one man, Hitler, because of his wickedness. But then it also seemed sad to me because, at least initially, it seemed as if what was written on the monument just wasn't true. Their memory wouldn't endure forever. And I think it's probably only a minority of people alive today that could actually name one person who gave their life fighting in the First or Second World War. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I expect it's a minority. And what's more, the cenotaph, when it was built, it was probably the largest structure in the city, but now it's dwarfed by all the offices and the shops that have built around it. And you know what? Probably one day it's going to crack, and probably one day it will fall down. I thought, is their memory really? Is it going to endure forever? But then another thought struck me. Yes, it would. Because God said this of his people, even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Behold, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Some of those who died will have had their names written, engraved permanently on God's unchanging hands. And this is the wonderful privilege of everyone who knows him and has put their faith in him. As the hymn says, my name from the palms of his hands, eternity will not erase. Impressed on his heart it remains in marks of indelible grace. When we are his, we are loved with an unchanging love, and we're never forgotten, and we're never, ever out of his mind. No, an unchanging God is not an uncaring or an unfeeling God, but one who does not stop caring and one who does not stop being compassionate for his people. What did God say to Moses? I have seen the affliction of my people and have heard their cry. I know their sufferings. And what did God do? He delivered them. And I don't know what each person here this morning is going through, but I do know this. God cares, and he is faithful. That is who he is, and he does not change.